It started with a magazine, a glossy one, thick with pictures of flowers and smiling couples. My daughter, Amelia, was flipping through it so fast the pages made a little whipping sound in the quiet of my living room. Swish, 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 the sound of my world starting to unravel. "Mom, you don't really need to be at the meeting with the planner," she said. She didn't even look up from a picture of a tiered cake. "It's all, modern stuff. Logistics. You won't understand. You won't understand." The words just hung there in the air. They didn't sound cruel, not the way she said them. It was matter of fact, like telling me I wouldn't understand how her phone worked, or why young people listen to that kind of music. It was a simple statement of my obsolescence. I didn't say anything. I just watched her. Her finger traced the edge of a photo. "Look at this place," she breathed, finally turning the magazine towards me. "The Ashford estate. Isn't it a dream? Right on the lake, with the old willow trees." Her face was glowing. The pure, uncomplicated joy of a bride-to-be. She was so lost in her dream that she didn't see the look on my face. She didn't see the world tilt on its axis. She was showing me pictures of a place, as if it were a fantasy, a destination on the moon. I just nodded. I let her talk about the incredible booking they'd managed to get, about how exclusive and sought after it was. I listened to her spin a fairy tale about the place where she would start her new life. What I didn't tell her was that my phone had rung that morning, just after 8. It was Mr. Davison, my property manager, a very precise, very professional man. He was calling to confirm the tentative booking made by a Mr. Mark Jennings for a wedding at the Ashford estate. He wanted to know if I, the owner, was aware of this, and if he should proceed with sending the official contract. I told him to hold off, just for a day or two. So I sat there, on my own sofa, a ghost in my own life, listening to my daughter describe my house to me. The house I didn't just buy, but built. The willow trees she loved. I planted them myself, 30 years ago. 2 fragile little sticks I bought from a nursery. I remember digging the holes, my back aching, thinking about a future where my children might play under their shade. I never imagined one of them would try to book it behind my back and then tell me I wouldn't understand. The silence in that room was heavy. It was full of everything I wasn't saying. I could feel a wall going up, brick by brick, right between us, a cold, hard wall. She was on one side, in her glossy, modern dream world, and I was on the other, in the silent, inconvenient truth. That evening was supposed to be a celebration, a dinner to talk details. Amelia had called it that, all bubbly and excited. "Mark and I are coming over. We'll talk details." Looking back, I realized I wasn't invited to talk. I was invited to be a line item in their budget. I roasted a chicken, the way they've always loved it, with rosemary and lemon. The house smelled warm, like family, like 1,000 other Sunday dinners, but something was different. The air was thin, brittle. They arrived, and Mark, my future son-in-law, gave me one of those air kisses near my cheek, smelling of expensive cologne. He had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He's a handsome boy. I'll give him that. Confident. The kind of man who walks into a room and assumes it belongs to him. I guess in this case, he wasn't entirely wrong. We sat at this very table, right where I'm sitting now. They had brought their laptops. They were so organized. Spreadsheets, timelines, lists of vendors. They were a team. A slick, efficient little corporation planning a merger, and I was the angel investor they were there to flatter. "So," Mark began, after taking a healthy sip of the wine he'd brought, "we've run some preliminary numbers. He slid his laptop around for me to see. It was a spreadsheet full of horrifying figures. The venue is the big one, obviously, but Amelia and I believe in investing in the atmosphere. Amelia nodded eagerly, her hand on his arm. It sets the tone for everything, Mom. I looked at the number they had budgeted for the Ashford estate. It was astronomical. It was a fantasy. And how do you plan to afford this, dear? I asked, keeping my voice level. Mark smiled that smooth, polished smile again. Well, that's where you come in, Eleanor. He said it so casually. He used my first name. Not Mom, not Mrs. Gable. Eleanor. Like we were partners in a firm. We were thinking, with your contribution, we can cover the venue and the caterer, and then my parents can handle the rest. He didn't ask. He informed. He spoke about my money the way you'd talk about the weather, a natural resource that was just there for them to use. My daughter just sat there, nodding, looking at me with those big, hopeful eyes. The same eyes that used to look at me when she wanted a new bicycle or a puppy. Only this time, she wanted a piece of my soul. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I picked up my water glass and just held it. It was cold against my fingers. I focused on that feeling, the cold. I brought something, I said, changing the subject. I got up and went to the bookshelf in the living room. On the bottom shelf was the old photo album, the one with the worn, dark green leather cover. It's heavy, full of things people forget. I placed it on the center of the table. It landed with a soft, solid thud. "What's this?" Amelia asked, a little impatient, wanting to get back to the spreadsheets. "It's the estate," I said, opening it. The first pages were black and white, a wide, empty field with a lake in the background. Then, pictures of foundations being dug, scaffolding going up. And there I was, in my early 30s, hair tied back in a messy bun, wearing muddy work boots and a plaid shirt, holding a roll of blueprints. My late husband, Robert, was beside me in one photo, laughing as I pointed at something off camera. I turned the page. Me, standing on the unfinished porch covered in sawdust. Me, on a ladder, helping to paint a window frame. I paused on a photo of me kneeling in the dirt, planting those 2 little willow saplings by the water's edge. My hands were caked in mud. I remember that day. I was so happy, so full of a future I was building with my own 2 hands. I looked up at them. I thought, I don't know what I thought, that maybe they would see, that they would understand what that place meant, that it wasn't just a venue, that it was my life's work. Amelia glanced at a few pictures. "Oh, wow, Mom, you were so young. Look at your hair." She gave a little laugh. Mark leaned over, flipped a few pages without really looking. "Impressive. A lot of work," he said, his tone dismissive. "Good thing we have drones and professional photographers now, huh? We'll get some amazing aerial shots." And then he closed the album. He didn't slam it, just a simple, final thump. He pushed it gently to the side of the table, making room for his laptop again. Okay, so back to the budget. That was it. That was the moment. It wasn't just the words you won't understand from that afternoon. It was this, the casual sweeping aside of my entire history. They weren't just ignoring me, they were erasing me. My sweat, my dreams, my love, my loss. It was all just an old, dusty photograph they didn't have time for. An anecdote to be tolerated before getting back to the real business of spending my money. The warmth of the roast chicken, the smell of rosemary, but it all vanished. I felt like I was encased in ice. The love I felt for my daughter, that fierce, unconditional mother love, it didn't disappear, but it retreated. It stepped back behind a wall of something cold and clear. Clarity. I was no longer looking at my little girl and her fiancé. I was looking at two strangers who had come into my home to liquidate my past for their future. A future where I was just a checkbook. A future where my role was to sign on the dotted line and then fade politely into the background because I was old and I wouldn't understand. They kept talking. Their voices became a meaningless buzz in the background. I nodded. I made small sounds of agreement, but I wasn't there anymore. I was somewhere else, in a quiet, calm, crystal clear place. I was an architect again, and I was looking at a flawed design that needed to be completely redrawn. They thought they were planning their wedding. They had no idea. As they were leaving, Amelia hugged me at the door. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "Thank you for being so supportive. This means the world to us." I just patted her back. My hands felt like they belonged to someone else. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it. The house was silent again. The photo album was still on the table, pushed to the side. I walked over and placed my hand on the worn leather cover. They're planning a party in my home, I thought. A party to celebrate their future, built on the foundations of a past they refused to see. And in that home, in that future, there is no room for me. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the album. Fine, I thought, a strange calm settling over me. I'll make a different plan for them. The house was so quiet after the sound of their car faded down the driveway. The silence they left behind was different from the usual peace I feel when I'm alone. It was a hollow, ringing silence, the kind that follows a loud noise. I stood in the hallway for a long time, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I walked back to the dining table. The photo album was still there, a dark square of forgotten history. Mark had pushed it aside to make room for his spreadsheet. Next to it sat a single dinner plate with the mangled remains of a chicken wing. I picked it up. My hands worked on their own, clearing the table, scraping leftovers, rinsing plates. I moved through my kitchen like a machine. I didn't want to think. I just wanted to do. To put things in their proper place. The smell of rosemary and lemon was gone. Now the air just smelled of cooled grease and that expensive cologne Mark wore. I opened a window to let the night air in. It was cold. It felt good. I went to bed, but not to sleep. I lay there in the dark, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't a night of tossing and turning, of crying into my pillow. The time for that was over. The hurt had crystallized. It had turned from a hot, messy pain into something hard and clear and cold, an idea. In my mind, I wasn't in my bed. I was walking through the halls of the Ashford estate, not as a mother, but as its architect. I saw the stress points, the structural weaknesses. The whole grand design of my family was failing because the foundation was being treated with contempt. My daughter and her fiancé weren't just being thoughtless. They were tenants who believed they owned the building and were planning to knock down the load-bearing walls to have a better party. They saw me as a memory, a sentimental old woman clutching a dusty photo album. They saw my home as a backdrop, a pretty picture for their perfect day. They had separated me from my own creation. They had turned my life's work into a rental property in their minds. And as I lay there, the thought came, so simple and so absolute. They are right. It is a property. It's a business asset. I built it not just with love, but with shrewd investments and years of hard work. I'd let the lines blur. I'd let home and family obscure the fact that it was also the single largest asset in my portfolio. I had been thinking with my heart. and that had to stop. By the time the sun started to lighten the edges of the curtains, the decision was made, not in anger, not in a fit of pique. It was made with the calm, quiet precision of an architect signing off on a new set of blueprints. I got up, made my coffee, and sat at this table, right here. The morning sun was coming through the window, making patterns on the wood grain. For the first time in months, my mind felt completely clear. The fog of hurt and confusion was gone. I knew exactly what I had to do. At 9 o'clock sharp, I picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Davison's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice as crisp and professional as ever. "Eleanor," he said. "Good morning. I was expecting your call." "Good morning, Victor," I said. My voice was steady. I didn't recognize it for a second. It was the voice I used to use in boardrooms years ago. Calm, decisive. "I have some new instructions regarding the Ashford estate." "Of course, go ahead." I could hear the faint sound of him typing. Effective immediately. I began, looking out the window at the garden. The estate is to be operated under a strict commercial protocol for all prospective clients. There will be no exceptions. There was a brief pause. "Understood," he said. "All clients." "Yes," I confirmed. "That includes my family. The informal family rate is discontinued. My daughter Amelia Gable and her fiancé Mark Jennings are to be treated as any other high-end client." I let that sink in. I could picture him on the other end, his face impassive, just taking notes. He's been my manager for 15 years. He's seen it all. He never asks personal questions. He just executes. He is the perfect instrument. "Please prepare the standard rental contract and a full itemized invoice for their wedding planner," I continued. "Use the premium 2024 season rates. No discounts. No special considerations. I want every single line item accounted for. The venue fee, the liability insurance, the corkage fee, the mandatory security deposit, the groundskeeping surcharge for large events. Everything. The full package," he stated. Not a question, but a confirmation. "The full package," I repeated. "And Victor, this is important. From this point forward, all communication regarding this booking is to be conducted exclusively in writing, emails only. I do not want you taking calls from them. Direct everything through the planner. I want a paper trail for every single interaction. Consider it done, Eleanor. I'll have the introductory packet and preliminary invoice sent to the wedding planner's office by noon today. Her details are on the initial inquiry, I believe." "They are," I said. "Thank you, Victor. You're a great help." "I'm just managing the asset as instructed, Eleanor," he replied. And that was it. We hung up. I put the phone down and took a deep breath. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relief, a profound sense of order being restored. It was like finding a column in a spreadsheet that had been throwing off all the totals and finally, calmly, deleting it. The numbers were lining up again. The structure was sound once more. I separated the mother from the owner. I had to. The mother was a liability the owner could no longer afford. The rest of the day passed in a strange, calm haze. I did some gardening. I paid some bills. I was just Eleanor Gable, a woman in her 70s, living her quiet life. And all the while, I knew that miles away, a quiet, professional digital bomb was being assembled. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Amelia. "Mom, we found the most amazing floral designer. She's expensive, but so worth it. She wants to do a walkthrough of the estate next week. Can you believe this is all happening? It feels like a dream." I looked at the message, at the little heart emoji. She was living in her dream, unaware that the dream was about to get a wake-up call. I typed back a simple, neutral reply. That's wonderful, dear. I'm sure it will be beautiful. I didn't offer to join the walkthrough. I didn't ask questions. I was just a distant, benevolent observer. It was the only role I could safely play now. At 12:15, my phone rang. It was Mr. Davison. Just a courtesy call to inform you, Eleanor, he said. The welcome packet, the standard terms of service agreement, and the preliminary invoice for the 50% security deposit have been officially emailed to the address on file for Evergreen Events. Attention, Miss Dubois. The email was sent at 12:05 p.m. Thank you for the update, Victor, I said. That was the first shot. A silent, digital shot fired in a war they didn't even know had been declared. An email. Such a simple, mundane thing. A document attachment, a PDF file. But I knew that when that wedding planner, Miss Dubois, opened that file, the glossy, beautiful dream my daughter was living in would collide with the hard, cold reality of a balance sheet. I went back to my gardening, plunging my hands into the cool, dark earth. I felt grounded. I wasn't the emotional mother anymore. I wasn't the sentimental keeper of memories. I was the owner. I was the architect. And I was finally taking back control of my property. The call to Mr. Davison was on a Tuesday morning. The rest of Tuesday was quiet. So was Wednesday. I spent those 2 days in my garden, pulling weeds, trimming the rose bushes. My hands were in the dirt, the good, honest soil. It kept me grounded. Every weed I pulled felt like clearing out a space in my own mind, getting rid of the clutter of hurt and doubt. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't angry. I was observing. I had set a large, heavy stone rolling down a hill, and I was simply waiting to hear the sound of it landing. The sound came on Thursday afternoon, just after 2:00. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. My phone, which was sitting on the table, began to vibrate. The sharp, insistent buzz against the wood was the only sound in the room. I walked over and looked at the screen. Amelia. I watched it vibrate. Once, twice. The screen went dark. A moment of silence. Then, it started again. Amelia. I let it go to voicemail. A few seconds later, a text message notification popped up. Mom, call me now. I read the words and felt nothing, just a calm certainty. I went back to wiping the counter. The phone buzzed again. Another call from Amelia. I ignored it. Then, a new text. What is this invoice Miss Dubois just sent me? Is this a joke? Ah, so the stone had landed. I finished wiping the counter, folded the cloth neatly, and placed it by the sink. The phone rang a third time. I looked at the screen. Amelia. I let it ring, and ring, and ring. Voicemail. A fourth call, almost immediately. Ignored. Then a fifth. This one I let ring until it stopped on its own. The house fell silent again. It was a strange feeling. For her entire life, when my daughter called with that kind of urgency, I would have dropped everything. I would have answered with my heart pounding, my mind racing through 100 possible disasters. Is she okay? Was there an accident? Is she sick? But now, I knew what the disaster was. And it wasn't mine. It was theirs. I sat down at the table and poured my tea. My hand was perfectly steady. This wasn't a punishment. It was a lesson in value. They had seen a home, a gift, a freebie. They needed to see what it was actually worth. The phone rang for the 6th time. I picked it up and pressed the green button. Hello, I said. My voice was even, quiet. Mom? Her voice was a shriek. high-pitched and frayed with panic and disbelief. "Mom, what is going on? Did you see the email? Miss Dubois just forwarded me this bill from the estate manager." I took a slow sip of my tea. "Oh?" I said. "Oh? That's all you have to say? It's an invoice for $125,000, just for the deposit. It says the total rental fee is $250,000. This has to be some kind of insane mistake. You have to call them and fix this right now." She was breathless, words tumbling over one another. I could hear Mark's voice in the background, a low, angry murmur. I pictured them, standing side by side, staring at a screen, their perfect, glossy dream cracking right before their eyes. I set my teacup down very gently in its saucer. The small clink of porcelain was the only other sound on my end of the line. "Darling," I said, and the calm in my own voice surprised me. "You told me yourself that it was all modern stuff, logistics, and that I wouldn't understand." There was a stunned silence on her end. I had used her own words, and they had become a wall. "So," I continued, "I decided you were right. It's clearly too complicated for me, so I've handed things over to the professionals to manage properly." "Professionals?" she stammered. "What professionals? Mom, what are you talking about? Just call the manager and tell him we're family." "For all questions regarding the booking," I said, my voice cool and clear, like a pane of glass, "you will need to contact the estate manager, Mr. Davison. He is now handling all communications. He represents the owner's interests." "The owner?" Her voice was a squeak of confusion. "What owner? You're the owner. What is this game?" "Please direct all your questions to Mr. Davison," I repeated. "His contact information is on the invoice. Goodbye, Amelia." And I ended the call. I pressed the red button, and the line went dead. The silence that followed was profound. It felt like the silence after a fever breaks. For the first time, I felt the shift. The tectonic plates of our family dynamic had just groaned and slid into a new, unfamiliar alignment. The floor was no longer tilted in her favor. It was level. My heart was beating, yes, but it wasn't the frantic beat of fear. It was the strong, steady rhythm of a heart that knows it's in the right place. I had spent years being afraid of their disapproval, their anger, their disappointment. But as I sat there, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I had built a boundary, and I had held it. It was made not of anger, but of fact. And facts are much stronger than feelings. Of course, it wasn't over. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time the screen read Mark Jennings. I let out a slow breath and answered. His approach would be different. "Eleanor," he began, his voice smooth, reasonable, the voice of a man trying to handle a hysterical situation. "I think there's been a major misunderstanding here." "There's no misunderstanding, Mark," I replied, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Look, Amelia is very upset," he said, a note of condescension creeping in. "We all know the estate is yours. This invoice, it's a bit dramatic, don't you think? If you're upset about something, let's just talk about it. There's no need to bring in lawyers and managers." "The instructions are quite clear," I said. "Mr. Davison is managing the property. He is the point of contact. If you have questions about the rental agreement, you need to put them in writing and send them to him." "Eleanor, stop this," he said, his voice hardening now. The velvet glove was off. "You're sabotaging your own daughter's wedding. Is that what you want? To ruin her happiness over some tantrum?" Tantrum. The word hung in the air between us. He thought this was an emotional outburst, a petty fit of pique from an old woman. He still didn't get it. He was still looking at the mother, not the owner. My tantrum, as you call it, is now a legally binding contract waiting for your signature, I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm. If the terms are not to your liking, you are, of course, free to seek another venue. I hear there are some lovely places available in the fall. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to do. All further communication on this matter must be in writing. I hung up on him, too. I turned my phone off. Completely off. The silence was now absolute. Later that evening, I turned my computer on to check my emails. There was one from Mr. Davison, sent an hour earlier. The subject line was, Update RE, Ashford Estate Booking, Gable divided by Jennings. The email was a masterpiece of professional detachment. Dear Eleanor, this is to confirm receipt of multiple communications from Miss Amelia Gable and Mr. Mark Jennings following the delivery of the preliminary invoice to their event planner. At 2:47 p.m., I received a voicemail from Miss Gable. The tone was distressed. No specific questions were posed. At 3:15 p.m., I received a call from Mr. Jennings. He attempted to discuss the family arrangement. I informed him, as per your instructions, that all inquiries must be submitted in writing. Between 3:30 p.m. and 4 p.m., I received 4 emails, 2 from each party. The content was emotional and accusatory. I have replied to each with a standard response, stating, "Thank you for your message. To ensure clarity and maintain a professional record, please consolidate your questions regarding the rental contract into a single itemized list, and I will be happy to provide a formal response." No further action has been taken. The invoice stands as delivered. Regards, Victor Davison. I read the email twice. He was my wall, a polite, impenetrable wall of procedure and protocol. They were throwing their emotions at it, and the wall was just standing there, unmoved. I looked at a copy of the invoice he had attached for my records. That number, $250,000. It wasn't arbitrary. It was the market rate. It was the culmination of 30 years of investment, of risk, of waking up at 4 a.m. to review blueprints and argue with contractors. It was the price of the view from the master bedroom, the price of the shade under the willow trees I planted with my own muddy hands. It was the value of my life's work, converted into the only language they seemed to understand. They thought I was sabotaging a wedding, but I wasn't. I was saving a landmark, my landmark. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like its architect again. I didn't have to wait long. Just as the first stars began to appear, a pair of headlights cut a sharp, angry path across my lawn. A car door slammed, then another. The crunch of their footsteps on the gravel driveway was too fast, too aggressive. They weren't coming for a visit. They were coming for a reckoning. I didn't get up. I just sat there in the gathering dark, listening to them come up the wooden steps of the porch. They stopped before me, 2 dark silhouettes against the deep blue of the twilight sky. Amelia was breathing heavily, and I could see the glint of tears on her cheeks even in the faint light. Mark stood beside her, rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked like a man about to go into battle. "How could you do this to me?" Amelia's voice was a ragged whisper, choked with tears and fury. "To us?" I took a slow sip of my iced tea. The clink of the ice against the glass was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "We should talk inside," I said, my voice even. I wasn't asking. I was stating a fact. I stood, my movements deliberate and unhurried, and walked into the house, leaving them to follow. I didn't turn on the soft living room lamps. I led them straight to the kitchen and flicked on the overhead light. It was harsh, fluorescent, a light that left no room for shadows or soft edges. This was a place for clarity, not comfort. I remained standing by the counter. They stopped in the middle of the room, looking exposed and out of place under the bright light. Mark spoke first, stepping forward as if to shield Amelia. He was still trying to play the part of the reasonable man dealing with an irrational woman. "Eleanor," he said, his voice tight with forced patience. "This has gone far enough. We understand you're upset about something, but this game you're playing is incredibly destructive. You need to stop." "This isn't a game, Mark," I said calmly. "Isn't it?" he shot back, his composure cracking. "Secret owners? Six-figure invoices? Ignoring your daughter's calls? What is this if not a cruel, childish game to punish her?" Amelia finally broke. "He's sabotaging us, Mom," she cried, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "This Mr. Davison, he won't even speak to us on the phone. He just sends these cold corporate emails. He's trying to ruin everything! And you're just letting it happen! Why won't you help us?" "Who is this horrible, mysterious owner who's trying to destroy my wedding?" Her voice rose to a wail on the last words. It was the cry of a child who had always been given what she wanted and now could not comprehend a world where the answer was no. It was the question they had been circling for days, the one they thought was the key to unlocking this whole nightmare. I looked at my daughter, her face streaked with mascara, her expression a mixture of rage and utter bewilderment, and I knew the time for silence was over. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, down the short hallway to my study. It's a small room, but it's where I keep my life in order. I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out a simple, thick manila folder. The edges were slightly worn. Inside were the documents that represented 30 years of my life. I walked back into the kitchen. They were standing exactly where I had left them, frozen in their tableau of righteous indignation. I walked to the table, the same table where they had dismissed my photo album, and I laid the folder down. It made a soft, definitive thud on the polished wood. "You want to know who the owner is?" I said, my voice quiet. "Open it." They stared at the folder as if it were a snake. Mark, ever the man of action, reached for it first. He opened the clasp and pulled out the sheaf of papers inside. The top document was the deed of ownership for the Ashford estate. I watched his face. I saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes as he scanned the legal jargon. I saw the moment his brain processed the name printed under grantee. His jaw went slack. His confident, handsome face seemed to crumble from the inside out. He went pale, a sickly, chalky color under the harsh kitchen light. He looked up at me, his mouth slightly open, no words coming out. Amelia, seeing his reaction, snatched the papers from his hand. Her eyes darted across the page. I saw her read my name. Once, twice. A small, strangled sound escaped her throat. She looked from the paper to my face, then back to the paper. The connection wasn't just being made, it was crashing into place with the force of a physical blow. "The owner," I said, breaking the ringing silence, "is me." I let that hang in the air for a long moment. I watched them try to rearrange the entire world in their heads to make that one fact fit. "And I'm not destroying anything," I continued, my voice gaining strength with every word. "I am simply issuing an invoice for services rendered. You wanted to rent a premier wedding venue. You're being charged the market rate." Amelia just shook her head, tears now falling freely. I don't understand," she whispered. "No," I said, and my voice was sharp now. precise as a surgeon's scalpel. You don't. That's the whole point. You wanted a wedding at the Ashford estate, but you didn't want the woman who built it to be there. Not really. You wanted her to sign a check and then sit quietly in the corner because she's old and she wouldn't understand. You wanted the house, but not the person. The backdrop, but not the history. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. Well, here is the lesson you needed to learn. It turns out you can't have one without the other. The estate and the woman who poured her life into it are the same thing. They are indivisible. I looked directly at my daughter. The anger was gone from my heart, replaced by a vast, sorrowful clarity. You stood in my living room and told me I wouldn't understand. And you know what, darling? That's the one crucial thing that you didn't understand. Mark finally found his voice. It was laced with a desperate, last-ditch attempt to regain control. This is insane, he sputtered, gesturing at the documents. This is unbelievably selfish. So what? Your feelings got hurt, so you're going to hold your own daughter's happiness hostage? You're going to ruin the most important day of her life out of spite? I straightened up and looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw him for what he was. A boy who saw value only in things that could be bought, and people only in what they could provide. My feelings have nothing to do with this, Mark, I said, my voice dropping to a low, cold tone. This is about respect, something you know very little about. This is about acknowledging the source of the things you so desperately want. You looked at my past. I gestured to the spot on the table where the photo album had sat, and you dismissed it as a quaint old story. You looked at me, and you didn't see a person. You saw a bank. You saw an obstacle to your perfect, modern wedding. I let my gaze settle on him until he had to look away. This isn't about my hurt feelings. It's about your character, or the lack thereof. That was it. The final blow. There was nothing left for them to say. They had no arguments left, no ground to stand on. Their entire version of reality had been built on a foundation of lies and assumptions, and I had just handed them the demolition order. Amelia was sobbing now, but it was a different kind of crying. It wasn't the angry, frustrated crying of before. It was the quiet, broken sound of someone whose world has just been irrevocably shattered. She was finally beginning to understand. The bill wasn't the punishment. The real punishment was this moment of clarity, this horrible, searing light in my kitchen, showing her the truth of what she had done. I walked to the kitchen door and held it open. The night air flowed in, cool and clean. The offer from the Ashford estate stands, I said, my voice formal, distant. The invoice is valid. Mr. Davison awaits your written instructions. You know the terms. Mark, defeated, took Amelia by the arm and guided her out. She wouldn't look at me. I watched them walk down the porch steps and get back into their car. I closed the door, turned off the harsh kitchen light, and stood alone in the darkness. My house was quiet again. On the table, the deed of ownership lay like a declaration of independence. I had won. But it was the quietest, most bitter victory of my life. I hadn't just reclaimed my property, I had reclaimed myself, and in doing so, I knew I may have just lost my daughter. The days that followed were a long, flat expanse of quiet. The wedding, I learned through a final, curt email from Mr. Davison, was officially canceled. The deposit was forfeited. As per the contract they never signed, the name, Jennings, vanished from my inbox. Mark vanished from the world. He ceased to exist, like a character in a book you finished reading. I didn't hear from Amelia. Not a text, not a call. The silence stretched from days into a week, then 2. I didn't reach out. The first brick of the new foundation had been laid, and it was a boundary. It was her turn to decide whether she wanted to cross it, and how. I had said my piece. The rest was up to her. I spent most of my time in the garden. It was late summer, and things were beginning to fade. I spent hours deadheading the roses, pulling back the overgrown ivy, preparing the beds for the coming autumn. There was a strange peace in it. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was just tending, mending. My life had been a construction site for so long, now it was a garden that needed quiet care. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after that final confrontation, I was on my knees by the hydrangeas when I heard a car on the gravel. It wasn't the angry crunch of before. The sound was slow, hesitant. The engine cut off, but for a long time, no door opened. I stayed where I was, my hands in the cool soil, and I waited. Finally, I heard the soft click of a car door and footsteps, slow and uncertain, on the path. I sat back on my heels and looked up. It was Amelia. She stood at the edge of the lawn, looking small and fragile in the afternoon Sunday. The glossy, confident bride-to-be was gone. This woman was pale. Her hair was simply tied back, and she wore no makeup. There were dark circles under her eyes, the kind you get from not sleeping, or from sleeping too much. She was just holding a small, rectangular object in her hands. She didn't speak. She just stood there, looking at me, her expression unreadable. I took off my muddy gardening gloves, laid them on the grass, and slowly stood up, my knees cracking in protest. I walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. We just looked at each other for a long moment. The air was thick with everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. Then, she held out the object she was carrying. It was a picture frame, a simple, dark wood frame, clean and unadorned. Inside it, under glass, was a photograph, the one from the old, worn-out album. It was the picture of me, in my 30s, standing on the unfinished porch of the estate. My hair was a mess. I had a smudge of sawdust on my cheek, but I was laughing, my head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. And next to me, a tiny Amelia, no more than 6 years old, with scraped knees and a missing front tooth, was proudly holding a hammer that was almost as big as she was. We were building, together. She had gone and had it professionally printed and framed. She had rescued that one moment from the pile of history she and Mark had so casually discarded. She just held it out to me. Her hands were trembling slightly. There were no words. No, I'm sorry. No excuses. There was just this small, framed piece of the past, offered up like a flag of truce, an acknowledgement, an apology made of paper and glass and memory. I took it from her. My fingers brushed against hers. The frame felt solid, real in my hands. I looked down at the smiling woman who used to be me, at the little girl who used to be her. I felt a crack form in the wall I had so carefully built around my heart. It wasn't a collapse, just a thin hairline fracture. I looked back up at her. Her eyes were filled with tears, but they weren't falling. "Come inside," I said, my voice a little rough. "I'll put the kettle on." She gave a small, jerky nod, as if she'd been holding her breath, and followed me into the house. The ritual of making tea was a comfort. The familiar sounds, the rush of water into the kettle, the clink of mugs on the counter, the click of the gas stove lighting filled the silence. We didn't speak. I made the tea just the way she likes it, with a splash of milk and 1 sugar, and carried the mugs to the kitchen table. She sat down tentatively in the chair where Mark had Saturday. I sat opposite her. The framed photograph was on the table between us, a new centerpiece. It stood where the invoice had been imagined, where the spreadsheets had been displayed, where the old album had been pushed aside. We both sipped our tea, The silence was different now. It wasn't an angry silence or an empty silence. It was a watchful silence, a fragile one. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. She was looking down into her mug. He's gone. Just that. I didn't need to ask who or why. I already knew. Mark couldn't exist in a world where he wasn't the one in control, where the assets weren't freely available. The dream he was selling required a fantasy, and I had replaced it with a very real, very expensive invoice. He hadn't just lost a wedding venue. He had lost the illusion of power. I just nodded. I didn't say I'm sorry because I wasn't. I didn't say I told you so because there was no victory in it. I just acknowledged her reality. She looked up at me then, her eyes full of a dawning, painful understanding. It was never about the wedding, was it? She asked, her voice cracking. All of that, the planner, the flowers, the drama, that wasn't the point. No, I said softly. It wasn't. It was about the house, she said, more to herself than to me. It was about you. I reached across the table, but I didn't take her hand. I just gently touched the corner of the new picture frame. The house is just wood and stone, darling. It was about what was being forgotten. A single tear finally escaped and rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. I forgot, she whispered. I got so caught up in the picture of it all that I forgot who painted the picture. And that was it. That was everything. We didn't talk much more after that. We just sat and finished our tea in the quiet kitchen. When she was ready to leave, she stood and gave me a hesitant, awkward hug. It wasn't the easy, familiar hug of before. It was the hug of two strangers trying to learn how to know each other again. I walked her to the door. As she was leaving, she turned back. Next Sunday? She asked. Dinner? I'll roast a chicken, I said. I watched her drive away, the gravel crunching softly under her tires. I went back to the kitchen and picked up the framed photograph. I carried it into the living room and cleared a space for it on the mantelpiece, right in the center. The house was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of a foundation settling into place. It was the quiet of a garden, after the rain, waiting for new things to grow. It wouldn't be easy. It would be slow. But it was a start. We had a new blueprint. And this time, we would build it together. It took time. It took a lot of time. The first few Sunday dinners after Amelia came back were careful. We moved around each other like two people learning a new dance, afraid of stepping on each other's toes. We talked about safe things, the weather, my garden, her new job at a local library. We never mentioned Mark. We never mentioned the wedding that wasn't. We never mentioned the invoice. We just let the silence hold the space for those things until, slowly, they began to lose their power. She started dating again about 6 months later, a man named James. The first time she brought him over for dinner, I was on guard. I watched him the way you watch a stray dog that wanders into your yard, not sure if it's friendly. But James was quiet. He had kind eyes and the hands of a man who works with them. He was a high school history teacher. He didn't wear expensive cologne or talk about investments. When I served the meal, he complimented my cooking. When dinner was over, he stood up and started clearing the plates without being asked. I watched his hands. He was gentle with the plates. He stacked them carefully, as if they were precious. I remembered Mark pushing my photo album aside with careless indifference, and I knew this one was different. A year passed. A year of these quiet Sunday dinners. A year of building something new, brick by careful brick. Amelia and James got married at the city hall, with just me and a few of their friends as witnesses. It was a simple, lovely afternoon. Afterwards, we came back here and had cake in my garden. Amelia wore a simple cream-colored dress, and she looked more beautiful and more at peace than I had ever seen her in the glossy pages of that wedding magazine. They live in a small apartment downtown with a tiny balcony they're trying to turn into a garden. They talk about their struggles, the leaky faucet, the student loans, the dream of one day having a small yard of their own. They don't look to me with expectant eyes. They just share their lives, the way you do with family. Tonight was one of those Sundays. We sat at this table, the three of us. The smell of roast chicken filled the kitchen, but this time it was a scent of comfort, not of confrontation. The conversation was easy. James was telling a funny story about a student's interpretation of the American Revolution, and Amelia was laughing, that real, deep laugh that I hadn't heard in years. At one point, she looked at me, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Mom," she said, "the tomatoes on our balcony are getting yellow leaves. We've tried everything. What do you think it is?" And just like that, there it was. The moment I didn't even know I was waiting for. They were asking for my advice. Not for my money, not for my connections, not for my assets, for my knowledge. For something that was mine, that I had learned with my own 2 hands in the dirt. I talked them through the possibilities: overwatering, nutrient deficiency, the type of soil they were using. They listened intently. James even took out his phone to take notes. They weren't just being polite. They were genuinely seeking my wisdom. They were seeing me, Eleanor, not as a resource, but as a source. In that small, simple moment, I felt a sense of wealth that no bank account could ever provide. The respect I had fought for wasn't something I had to demand anymore. It was just there, a quiet, sturdy part of the new foundation we had built. Later, after we'd cleared the dishes together and the coffee was finished, they stood to leave. It was the same ritual as always: hugs at the door, promises to call during the week. But tonight, I said, "Wait a moment." I walked over to the old brass hook by the door. It's been there for as long as I can remember. Hanging on it was a single, heavy key. It was old, made of ornate brass, with an intricate, almost floral head. It was the original master key to the Ashford estate, the one I'd kept for myself when I had the modern locks installed. It was a key that felt like history in your hand. I took it off the hook. It felt heavy, substantial in my palm. I walked back to Amelia and James, who were watching me with curiosity. I held it out to Amelia. She looked at the key, then at me, her eyes wide with confusion. "What is this?" "It's a key," I said simply. I saw a flicker of the old hurt in her eyes, a shadow of the past. I knew what she was thinking, but I met her gaze, and my own was steady and calm. "This is not a gift," I said, my voice soft but clear. "It's an invitation. Your first wedding anniversary is next month." I placed the key in her open palm. Her fingers closed around it. I could see her feel the weight of it, the cold, solid reality of it. "I want you to go there for the weekend." I continued, "Just the 2 of you. Open up the house, walk by the lake, sit under the willow trees. I want you to start making your own memories there." I paused, letting the words settle. This was the most important part. "But I want you to do it, remembering the foundation the house is built on. It's not just wood and stone, it's work. It's love, it's respect. A home is something you build, not something you're given." Amelia's eyes filled with tears. But this time, they were not tears of anger or shame. They were tears of grace. She looked at James, who put his arm around her. his own eyes shining with an emotion I could only describe as profound understanding. He looked at me over her shoulder. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick. "We will." She couldn't speak. She just nodded, clutching the key to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. I watched them leave, their car rolling slowly and quietly down the driveway. I closed the door and leaned against it, just as I had on that terrible night a year ago. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the past, full of the present, and now, full of a future I could finally believe in. I walked into the living room and stood before the mantelpiece. The framed photograph of me and a 6-year-old Amelia, the little builder with her big hammer, seemed to glow in the soft lamplight. My life wasn't over. It hadn't been relegated to an old photo album. I had simply entered a new season, the season of the harvest. I had passed on my true legacy. Not the estate, not the money, but the understanding of what it all meant. The key was no longer a symbol of ownership. It was a symbol of trust. And that, I realized, was a foundation strong enough to build anything on.